My parents laughed when I signed the lease for my storefront. They didn't do it in a small, private way. They did it loud at dinner in front of neighbours who kept visiting for lemon bars and parish gossip. My mother clapped the back of her hand against her knee and said, "A bookstore? At your age? As if people read anymore." My father winked at my cousin and said, "She'll change her mind. She always does." They made jokes about my hobby for months. They told friends that I was trying something before getting a real job. They called me sentimental. They compared me silently to my brother, who they reminded everyone had a steady corporate salary and a 401k he checked like a rosary. That hurt because they weren't strangers. They were the first people who read drafts, who munched on my early cookies when I was testing recipes, who sat on milk crates in the back of the shop during the slow evenings and told me stories. The laughter felt like a betrayal precisely because it cut through everything they'd once said that made me believe I could do it. It said I had no right to call myself an adult making choices, no right to risk anything that mattered to me. It meant that when the bills stacked up, their words would be used as evidence that I wasn't serious, even when I was the only serious one in the room. I need to be clear about the setup because people sometimes assume the simple version. I was ungrateful and punished my parents. The truth is more complicated and rooted in responsibilities I never asked for and privileges they never acknowledged. I moved back into the house on Elm Street at 29. My lease on a tiny apartment in the city had ended when my landlord sold the building. I had the option to move across town, but the downtown storefront I wanted was inefficient and expensive without a backstop. My parents owned the house free and clear, or so I thought. They had a mortgage placed years ago, and my father still worked part-time doing bookkeeping for a small firm, but they were the kind of people who could make you feel like you were getting a gift even when you were asking for a handout. My plan was simple on paper. I would open a small neighbourhood bookstore with a coffee counter and a few pastry items I baked at home. I had a modest following from an online newsletter. I had negotiated a 6-month reduced rent for the first year on the storefront, and I had saved $22,000 from freelance gigs and teaching weekend classes. The numbers were tight. Monthly rent, $2,100. Projected gross sales, $9,000 in month 1 with steady growth. Break even at month 6. If I could keep fixed costs under control. I told my parents the plan because they asked. They replied with jokes and an offer. Move back in, no rent, keep your expenses low. I said yes because I was exhausted and the math was kinder if I didn't need to pay $1,200 for an apartment while also starting a business. That is the first power imbalance. They gave the seeming kindness of a home and used it as leverage. In the beginning, it looked like generosity. I could focus on the shop and bring them coffee on Sunday mornings. I cooked dinner sometimes. They took my declines, my desire to be treated like a grown person, personally. The first escalation came when customers started trickling in. The shop cleared its first month of rent. The second month was better. The third month, I hired a part-time barista. My parents came in sometimes and pretended not to watch. Then, at a weekend sidewalk sale, my father introduced his friend, who owned a small chain of hardware stores, to my line of hand-bound journals. The man bought 10 and praised them. I thought maybe this would change things. The next week, that same man told my father privately that he wouldn't be expanding the chain, but he admired the aesthetic. My father told me this and then, in the same breath, quoted an old joke that my brother had used at family gatherings. "You'll be back in 6 months. Kiddo." The jokes turned to suggestions that felt like a public audit. Maybe put the books online, maybe do custom orders, maybe teach a class. Each one was a disguised dismissal. Helpful sounding, but always followed by a story about how someone they'd known had failed. My mother would call during my busiest hours and ask why I hadn't applied for a job that paid real benefits. She would say it so casually that my hands would freeze on the cash register. The small ears of neighbours heard, and the rumour spread. The shop was not a business. It was a phase. Then manipulation crept into logistics. I had rented a small living room apartment upstairs in the house, a room with a thin wall that let me hear if my parents were moving around at night. I paid a nominal amount toward utilities because my reserve was meant for the shop. My parents began to forget to tidy the shared spaces and then complain to me that my laundry lingered. They started leaving passive-aggressive notes in the kitchen about the heat bill, comments about the way I loaded the dishwasher, and they would call my sister to relay these inconveniences with the urgency of a crisis. The message was the same as the jokes. You are uncomfortable here because you belong somewhere else. When I confronted them directly, my father shrugged. "We didn't mean to be harsh," he would say, "but you have to be realistic." The phrasing was always soft, like a doctor delivering a diagnosis that could be reversed if only I would surrender. That month, my landlord in the city called to tell me the sale of the building had closed on time. It felt like a small threat I could ignore and accept my savings were tied up in inventory and a new espresso machine. I could no longer rely on a cushion of options. I was anchored by the house, by the shop, by the fact that the breakfast crowd had started to remember my face. My dependency was not dramatic. I simply had nowhere else that made business sense. I was financially constrained in a narrow, practical way. I also had guilt. They were aging and their health had times when it looked fragile. My mother's ankle would flare. My father had a twinge in his knee. Once he had called me late at night and asked for help with a phone call he needed to make. I went because families do these things. Once you do something like that, it becomes part of the ledger. Escalation 2, exclusion. My parents began excluding me from decisions about the house in small ways. The contractor they consulted, the lights they chose, even the handyman they hired. They would tell me after the fact that they'd decided to install expensive recessed lighting in the attic for resale value, or that they had signed up for a new cable package. It seemed benign until those expenses showed up in their bank ledger. The credit card bills climbed. They talked to me about frugality at the same time. They spent. And my presence, my unpaid presence, began to look like a freestanding problem. One evening, 2 years in, I opened the post and found a letter from a local bank. It was a notice. A second mortgage application had been filed, or rather, already approved, in my parents' name. The bank's name was familiar. It's the same small credit union my father liked for the personal feel. I asked them about it at dinner. My mother flipped the page in the magazine and said, "We needed a little cash. We put some things in order." They made it sound like an innocuous short-term loan. But the numbers didn't add up in private. The payment on the new mortgage would be another $1,200 a month. I did the math quickly. Their fixed income didn't cover the new payment without dipping into savings or selling some asset. I mentioned that quietly and they said it would be fine. It wasn't. The next escalation was humiliation. They called me at the shop one afternoon and said the mortgage company had been calling for payments. I walked out to the sidewalk and asked them, "Why didn't you tell me?" They said they were managing it. They were embarrassed. My mother spoke in clipped tones, and my father tried to hand-wave responsibility into a furrowed smile. But then my father started telling his friends in the neighborhood that I was the one with the financial plan. "She's the entrepreneurial one," he'd say. "We had to take a loan now so things would be easier." People looked at me with the amused pity people reserve for people who are trying. Then the bank's calls increased. There were letters and overtime fees and a late notice that arrived stamped in red. The bank sent an inspector to the house to evaluate collateral. The inspector asked detailed questions. He was polite. He asked whether the house was occupied and whether it generated rental income. He asked if there were other liens. I answered him carefully. Inside, my parents sat in their chairs and stared at the wooden armrests like two people waiting for weather. The first consequential reaction I had was to tighten. I stopped lending money for the pastry supplies my mother sometimes asked for. I stopped bailing out small crises. I also told myself I would not let their financial chaos become my own. Those decisions made me feel like my heart had a weight in it. The consequence was immediate. They took me less seriously. Their mockery returned, but now it arrived with a note of righteous indignation. "We helped you," they'd say. "You should be grateful." A new escalation involved a relative I had trusted, my brother. He came by one night after a late shift and said, "You should sell. You'll never make it in that market." He said it with affection, making it worse. He suggested that our parents could use help managing the bills if I sold and took a better paying job. I felt betrayed because he had walked through the shop 1,000 times and had once bought books as presents for his friends. He had, in the past, called me to celebrate small wins. Suddenly, he sounded like everyone else, someone who had already picked a side. I tried to hold the middle ground. I increased inventory, added a weekday book club, marketed aggressively. Money came in more regularly, but never sufficiently. The bank notices kept arriving, and in my restless hours at night, I would track the dates and the penalties like a small, cruel calendar. Then the situation worsened in a way I didn't foresee. My parents, pressed by the demands of the new mortgage and a medical bill, opened a home equity line of credit and began to withdraw. They told me they were using it for house improvements. They repainted the living room. I installed expensive curtains and hired a gardener. I asked questions and was told not to worry. The ledger refused to match the story. The next escalation was active sabotage. My mother, without telling me, called the local zoning board to complain about the cafes, early morning deliveries, and the smell of roasting beans. An inspector showed up and cited me for a minor code violation. The espresso machine needed a different ventilation duct. It was a complaint-driven enforcement. My license was temporarily suspended until I installed a duct and paid for an inspection. $1,200 all told. I could have fixed it. I found a loan quickly. But the humiliation of being cited in front of my regulars, people who had become friends, felt deliberate. I was not naive. I had done nothing to provoke a neighbor complaint. Someone had filed it. When I asked my parents who had made a complaint, they looked surprised. My sister laughed later and said, "You know how Mom is about rats and smells?" By now, the pattern was clear, small acts, then larger, all directed to remind me that I was peripheral. The emotional weight of the mocking and the logistics culminated in a confrontation. One winter night, after a particularly brutal week of unpaid invoices and a cracked steam wand in the espresso machine, I told my parents I was thinking about refinancing the business or looking for outside investment. My father's face closed. He told me I was being unrealistic. He said, "You could always look for a job in management. My friend Steve is hiring." My mother said, "You sound tired." That word, tired, was the softest weapon. It implied my failure was fatigue, not structural, and it owed nothing to the countless nights I had worked until midnight, hand-folding receipts and balancing inventory. The low point was not a single event, but a stacked avalanche. It happened when I received an official notification, a notice of default on the second mortgage because of missed payments. It was a formal step the bank takes after several months of late payment. The phrase they used was dry, default. The letter suggested remedies but warned of possible acceleration of the note. I felt the room tilt. My parents looked at me as if the letter were an intruder that would leave after a week. The reality was different. The bank did not care about family stories. It cared about numbers. At that desperate, soft-edged moment, I lost leverage. I had no legal claim to the house. And I had given away my potential leverage by living there. I could leave the house, sell the shop, or figure out another way to pay. I had to be honest about what I had. A small, steady business with a loyal customer base, a modest profit margin of around 12 to 15%, and a savings account that had accumulated from years of careful living. I also had something I had never contemplated owning, an understanding of how debt works because I'd spent nights reading contracts and talking with the local credit union manager about risk. The turning point arrived unexpectedly when I was sorting through paper in the attic looking for a box of holiday lights. I found an old folder with promissory notes, documents for the house that I'd seen but never examined. In the envelope was a copy of the original mortgage and a recent notice from the bank's servicing department naming the bank's intent to assign the loan to an investor if the payments went unpaid. The note included the loan number and the name of the servicing company. It was a small piece of paper, but it contained the exact technical language a creditor needs. I took a photo and sat at the kitchen table until 2 a.m, reading legalese with the sleep-deprived focus of someone who had slowly become hardened by necessity. No speeches, no cinematic confessions, just a document I could not unsee. Buying a debt is not a glamorous act. It's not revenge in the movies. It's paperwork and capital and the willingness to be considered the villain in a small domestic tragedy. But as soon as I read the right lines about assignment and transferability, I realized what was possible. If the bank sold the note, any buyer could become the holder and could enforce the terms. Typically, investors buy bad debt at a fraction of the balance. They buy paper and hope to collect. It struck me that a bank would not sell a new note unless the risk justified the discount. It also struck me that an insider buyer who lived in the house and cared about the outcome could arrange terms that a faceless investor would not. I did not plan a spectacle. I called the bank. I asked to speak to the asset management officer. He returned my call a week later and was patient. I asked naive questions. What happens when a loan is in default? Can loans be sold? He explained in procedural language that felt sterile and oddly comforting. Loans get packaged and sold. Sometimes small community investors buy notes. I asked if private parties could buy a note. He said yes, provided they had funds and the bank's sale process could be navigated. I took notes. I called my accountant at the shop and asked her to run a conservative projection of what it would cost to service the note if I bought it, the outstanding balance, possible legal costs, escrow, and taxes. Then I made a decision that some will call cold. I would buy the debt. There are many ways to imagine that moment. For me, it was quiet and technical. I had built a small reserve, set aside for emergencies, equal to about 6 months of operating expenses. I had also saved additional funds by living frugally and refusing the small perks that made life easier. It was not a prepared strike. It was an alignment of small, deliberate savings set against a legal opportunity. I arranged a meeting with a broker who specialized in distressed notes. I was blunt and explained I wanted the note with the explicit intent of negotiating a reasonable resolution that could secure the house, but also protect my business. The broker listened and then offered me 2 options: buy the note outright at a discount, or buy an interest in the note and partner with another investor. I chose to buy the note outright. The figure was not dramatic, less than half the balance due. I wrote the check. The paperwork took weeks. There were lawyers and title searches and the broker's fee. I felt sick in the stomach at times, not from the financial risk, but from the thought of calling my parents to say casually that I now had a legal interest in their home. I did not call them at all. I waited until the transfer was recorded. The legal transfer changed the power dynamic in a way that was immediate and oddly anticlimactic. I had not intended to humiliate. I had intended to protect a house that had been my shelter for years and to buy myself out of a position where my choices were always undermined. But power, once formalized, requires action. The bank sent me the default files, and I found a small, hardly poetic satisfaction in reading the red-stamped notices that had been sent to them. The documents no longer had abstract weight. They were actionable. I decided to serve notice in the way creditors do: straightforward, legal, and with a minimum of fanfare. I hired a process server. The eviction notice is not a personal weapon. It's a factual instrument saying the creditor has certain rights. I drafted a realistic proposal before any confrontation, a repayment plan that matched their means, an offer to mediate, and an alternative. If they could not keep the house, I would accept a structured sale that would ensure they received a portion of the proceeds. I was not interested in their ruin. I was interested in leverage that would force conversation. When my mother took the envelope, she did not read it in the doorway. My father opened it and set it slowly on the kitchen table. They read and then looked up at me as if I had found a new language. "What is this?" my mother said first. Her voice was small. "It's the note," I said. "I bought the loan." My mother's face hardened in a manner I had only seen when she was defending someone small in the grocery line. My father's mouth opened and closed 10 times. "You what?" he said. It was not an accusation so much as astonishment. There were no shouted speeches. There was a tight, immediate silence, like the moment a stage's lights are cut off. Then there was talk. There were tears from my mother. There was anger from my father. The neighbours left the porch. The kids at the bus stop watched from behind their backpacks. The consequence was not cinematic retribution. It was painfully administrative. I filed a foreclosure action on paper because I had to protect the value of a note that, if I left it to rot, would have been sold to some distant collector who would have been less patient. At the same time, I sent them the repayment plan and the mediation offer. I proposed a structured payment that would bring them current within 18 months if they could commit to living within a constrained budget. I proposed a buyout if they preferred to sell the house to avoid foreclosure. I proposed options because I remembered the nights they had fed me and the small kindnesses of childhood that are not erased because of adult failures. What broke between us was not a legal form, it was trust. My parents had used ridicule to keep their own shame at bay. They had refused to see how their irresponsibility had real consequences. Buying the note forced that into the light. My brother took their side. The neighborhood was split. The shop saw a tiny uptick in customers who wanted to see whether the girl who had been mocked by her parents would succeed. Some customers told me it made them uncomfortable. Others offered words of support that felt like thin bandages over a deeper wound. The legal process moved slowly. There were mediation sessions where an impartial person listened to both sides, and small compromises were proposed. I learned that my father had health expenses he had hidden because he didn't want me to shoulder them. I learned my mother had lost her job briefly and had not told anyone. I also learned that they resented me for buying the debt because they saw it as a betrayal of the family covenant. I believed I was enforcing boundaries. They believed I had become the enemy. A consequence I hadn't predicted was the way my business would be affected by community gossip. The customer base had its share of people who believed family should never be monetized in that way. A few people stopped coming. A few more started coming as an act of solidarity. My profits tightened as we navigated legal fees and increased utility payments that had been resolved as part of mediation. There were nights when I cried in the back room, the sound small and private like a splinter being removed. The payoff was not poetic. The foreclosure was avoided. My parents agreed to a short sale eventually because they couldn't meet the repayment schedule realistically. They moved into a smaller apartment 2 towns over. I helped them pack with my own hands. We packed dishes and the old records from the attic and a stack of faded photos. The last box I packed was a shoebox of my mother's letters from when she was 20. She pressed it into my shoulder and said, "You always were stubborn." We did not reconcile with an embrace. We ate at different times for months. We spoke measuredly for a year. I visited them sometimes, and they visited the shop sometimes. There were flinches in conversation about loss. I would see my father watch the door as if wondering if I would leave that day. My mother called me sometimes and asked innocuous questions about inventory. We moved forward like two people who had been in a boat that hit a rock and had to patch the hull together. There were realistic payoffs beyond the legalities. My shop stabilized. I refined the business model to focus on online sales of journals and a subscription box that turned out to be unexpectedly profitable. The slow, sustainable success I had always wanted arrived not as vindication, but as a form of normalcy. I paid myself a modest salary and kept the doors open. I returned the business to the community without fanfare. People bought books, coffee, and sometimes bought a desk calendar because it reminded them to be disciplined. I paid down the note I had purchased at a measured pace. I took no joy in the payments that flowed in from my parents. They felt like an economic extension of a family drama. Emotionally, the resolution was quieter. The humiliation that had been heaped upon me quieted, partially because there was no longer a living audience for it. My parents stopped mocking me in public, not because they had suddenly changed their view, but because there was less benefit to doing so. If I learned one practical thing in all of this, it is that power often shows up as paperwork, then as silence. There are no neat moral sentences I can place at the end of this. I did something that many would call ruthless. I did it because the ledger of what I could bear had filled. I did it because I wanted a stable place to come home to after closing the shop. I did it because the small decisions that create a life, paying bills, keeping the lights on, buying flour, are as consequential as grand gestures. I lived with the consequences. I gave my parents the chance to avoid losing their home cleanly, and they chose to sell. They kept dignity in the way people sometimes do, quietly, by arranging their own terms. The final scene I will carry with me is simple. The day they left the house, we stood on the porch and watched a light rain make the street glossy. My mother tucked her hand into mine for a moment, very briefly, like a child whose parent steadies themselves at the curb. We both knew words would be inadequate. We both knew that the past could not be rerun. We both knew that the shop needed fresh shelves in the morning. If I could say one thing that isn't a lesson or a prescription, it's this. Most families don't look like a single story. They look like a series of small betrayals and small mercies. Sometimes you keep your head down and pay the cost. Sometimes you make a choice that looks like cruelty because it is the only functional option left. I'm telling you this because the beginning of the story was humiliation, my parents' laughter, and the end is a quieter thing. A shop that pays rent and a house that two people left with boxes. None of it feels theatrical. It feels real. It feels like the kind of grief that people tuck into pockets and carry with them. If you like this story, please leave a like. If you want to hear more stories like this, please subscribe. Did anything in my story remind you of something you lived through? I'd like to hear about it in the comments.